Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group, with Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, bringing you all the chatter that matters.
Well, Phil, we've got a plan today, haven't we?
Yeah,
a plan has come together.
Yeah, we've got a bit of a plan, but we have got a busy show today. So do grab your cup of coffee or cup of tea or whatever your favourite beverage is, then and sit back and stay tuned, because we've got a bit of a used car special this weekend for you. So we're going to be focusing on the March trends. And we've got a bit of a recap of Derren Martin's interview from CAP HPI on the movements within the trade values, particularly around sort of by sector, age profile, and more importantly by fuel type, and his thoughts on what happened in the first quarter of this year. So we're playing an extract of Derren's interview from earlier on in the week. Then we've also got Phill Jones, who's joined us, and he's Chief Operating Officer at eBay Motors Group, and he'll be sharing his latest market view data, and again sharing his views on what happened in March, and more importantly what's happened for the first quarter of this year.
Now, although we have a packed show today, we will still share some of the week's headlines in brief with you. But before we start, we can recommend, this is something you found, Phil, and I really enjoyed it. It was a podcast, not that we tend to promote other podcasts, but this was from Automotive News, which went out during the week. And it was recorded. It was streamed after we recorded last weekend's show. Now, anyone who listened to last week's show will recall that we covered this breaking, evolving Jaguar Land Rover story about how Jaguar Land Rover as a brand will continue its representation in the UK and other markets as it pitches Jaguar more and more upmarket and will need fewer showrooms to sell it. So this is very much the US angle, isn't it? Because this podcast, the presenters actually spoke to some dealers affected by this downsizing move, and what it implied was that the affected dealers who will be losing Jaguar, they're being encouraged to take a bigger allocation of Range Rover models and Defender models to fill that showroom space. So quite an intriguing trend there.
No, and it's right. And I mean, those that are aware of obviously the JLR brand, I mean, it is a big US marketplace for them, big export market over to the US there. So it's a very prominent dealer market over there in the US. But as you say there, I mean, they were talking as to, they weren't really given much choice. They were sort of, they were encouraged and incentivized that to take those additional, as you say, the Range Rover and Defender product, and those that don't want to do it, then they're obviously not going to be in that relationship going forward by the sounds of it. So yeah, I listen to the Automotive News podcast on a regular basis, because it just gives me that snippet from what's happening over the water there in the US and some of those international markets. But yeah, very, very timely and insightful around particularly our recent chats with the podcast and with Steve Young. We chatted with Steve Young, didn't we, at ICDP. That is still available on your podcast feed if you've not yet listened to that interview with Steve Young. He chats about the GLR plans and what that may mean for the UK market.
Yeah, and a fun fact from that particular podcast is that they say that there's 395 Jaguar Land Rover dealers in the US, and they'd calculated that that equates to 2 Jaguar car sales per month per showroom. So it sort of highlights the scale of what Jaguar Land Rover face in the US and other markets. So do urge you to head over there and check that one out.
Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group.
So only a few headlines this week from the Daily Telegraph. Asset Finance International and car dealer. And starting with the Daily Telegraph, the headline there is "Net Zero Ban on Petrol Cars in Chaos After Brussels Climb Down." So this was news that broke on Tuesday, and there is a backstory to this because Phill, you and I, we've both been tracking this story over recent months in Europe, whereby German manufacturers have been lobbying for a change in EU rules, which sees the elimination of new petrol and diesel cells in 2035. So effectively 5 years after the UK ban comes into place. But this lobbying amongst the German manufacturers has been successful because the German government has actually taken the matter up with Brussels, and it looks though there's a bit of a climb down that's happened within Brussels that will allow e-fuels to be considered after the 2035 ban.
Yeah, I mean, there's it's been happening for a while. I mean, it started a while ago, and then it got stopped by European Parliament over there that they wouldn't address it. Then it got raised again because particularly some the manufacturers that operate out of Germany in particular are saying that it's too early, too soon, and they're not going to be ready, and that there's a place for e-fuel for longer in the European marketplace, because you can go. I mean, we look at the UK, don't we, in terms of thinking about that, the infrastructure challenges that we've got in the UK and the issues there. But actually, when you start going up to Europe, it's very much by country over there now. There's different markets ahead of others. There's better infrastructure than others. So when you're operating across Europe, it's an entirely different story for those European manufacturers. So there is a lot of pushback on that, and I suppose it depends on whether the UK will react. There is things happening over in the UK as to whether the UK government will do something, whether they will react, whether they will follow what's happening over in Europe around e-fuels. But I suppose the question with this one, Curtis, is are we too far down the track? Are the
Yes.
manufacturers too far down now? We hear a lot from manufacturers that they're talking that there'll be full EV by 2025, some earlier than others. We talk about fleet operators that have got predominantly EV operators now. Is it too far now to start to slow this down? Is the big question.
Yeah, I think you've got a point there because the deadline was bold, wasn't it? Yeah, when it was announced, it was bold. There wasn't a huge amount of time given to OEMs and indeed retailers to sort of rethink the existing model and plan accordingly. But a lot of OEMs they've made big advances in terms of what they've rolled out in terms of EV vehicles, and they're probably in a better position now than they thought they would have been 2 or 3 years ago. But this is a particularly interesting one because e-fuels, I mean, they're synthetic versions of fossil fuels, and there's been more and more talk about e-fuels just over recent months. And the German manufacturers have really got behind this to the point that Porsche have actually taken a £75 million stake in an e-fuel plant. Yeah. So it just shows their thinking and what their planning is, and that they're not putting all their eggs in the EV basket. So this one's got to play out. How it affects the UK remains to be seen, but we'll be keeping close tabs on this.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it does say that it's, on the back of Germany, what they're demanding, and obviously that exemption for cars that burn e-fuel, and they're arguing that they are carbon neutral when produced using renewable energy and carbon captured from the air. So they won't, in their words, spew further climate changing emissions into the atmosphere. So probably giving them a little bit further time to things to transition a bit easier over there in Europe. But sticking with EVs, and a couple of things from BYD this week, and we're heading over to Asset Finance International there, and BYD signs a memorandum of understanding with Octopus Electric Vehicles Limited, which you may have heard of as people talk about EVs. And this is to supply vehicles over the next 3 years, up to 5,000 units. So, it's quite interesting, isn't it, Curtis? I mean, the amount of times we're talking about BYD.
Yeah, they've got a regular slot on the podcast now, haven't they?
Just in months. I mean, bearing in mind, it weren't long ago that when, I think, what car was asking about brands that people recognise, and BYD was certainly not in the top brands that the consumers would recognise for these Chinese operators that were coming to the UK. You had your Polestars, you had your Sepangs and Neos and this kind of thing. But, BYD are shifting very, very quickly. I mean, that's 5,000 units, but it shows their intent. They're moving very quickly with this. And, I suppose it's at what speed they'll come. But, the outlets that we talked about last week around Pendragon, the volume of outlets that they're expecting to have by the end of this year and over the next 2 or 3 years, and now talking about this supply of vehicles to the sector in terms of the volume aspirations that they've got, is showing their intent for the UK market.
Yeah, definitely. And these vehicles will be available through leasing and salary sacrifice schemes. So it's definitely one to watch this. And what a great kickstart!
It is,
5,000 units.
It is, and it shows that volume. And something else that did hit this week in the Financial Times, which is quite interesting, and it's not necessarily one of the stories we were going to cover, but the headline is that Tesla's price war in China backfires as BYD sales surge. So what they're saying over there is that the Tesla move to slash the prices, not just in our market in the US, but obviously over there in China, loses market share. And that's talking about losing it to the Warren Buffett-backed BYD that we've just been discussing there, putting Chinese car makers on track to sell more passenger vehicles than their foreign rivals for the first time in 2023 there. So, I don't know what's happening with this, but certainly the reduction in price over in China there has not stimulated sales for Tesla. It's actually accelerated sales for their rivals, being BYD. So some interesting things happening in that battery electric vehicle market already, Curtis.
Yeah, I don't think that was part of Elon Musk's grand plan, was it?
No, probably more for the UK now, but we'll see.
But staying with all things electric, heading over to Car Dealer, and the headline is more car dealers holding off buying electric used cars as prices plummet, reports BBC. So this was, I actually caught this. It was a radio show on Monday. It was on BBC You and Yours. And it was an interesting one because it was addressing this issue of the way prices are falling in the used EV market. And the part that stood out for me was there was an interview with James Capel of CarKey, who are a Derby-based independent dealer. So he actually put forward the case of how this affects dealers. So as we've been talking about on the podcast over recent months, prices have been high in the wholesale sector, and there has been some nervousness about buying high because by the time they hit the forecourts, some of those prices have fallen. So he actually gave the example of a Nissan Leaf that was sitting on his forecourt. He paid £8,400 for, and he was retailing it, this week at £8,295. And he described it as a glorified ornament on his forecourt. And I think it just illustrates some of the pain that dealers are going through at the moment. So it's an interesting program. It's worth listening to. It also features James Baggott from Car Dealer and some of the conversations he's been having with dealers on this.
No, and it's right. And I think, referring back to the Derren Martin interview that we're going to play shortly, and even if you've listened to it earlier on in the week when we published it, that there is market, there is opportunity in battery electric vehicle, but you just need to go in with your eyes wide open. You need to understand the market that you're going into. You need to operate them separately to a certain degree in terms of the rest of your stock profile. You need to know what market's moving, when it's moving, what's happening in the wider market. I mean, I've seen some of the stuff around the Nissan Leaf, the dynamics of the volumes of those, who's selling them into the market, and the pricing of them as well. So you just need to be aware of it and be prepared to move them on. And as we touched on at the end of the interview there with Derren, and quite interestingly with the coming up interview with Phill Jones from eBay Motors Group around understanding your customer, understanding how to proposition the battery electric vehicles to your customers, because you need to think, particularly, you need to think differently. They're buying differently, they're looking at them differently, they haven't got the same buying behaviours as your combustion engine. They're buying for different reasons. So I think there's a lot going on in that space, that there's a lot of learnings to take place at the minute, but it's increasing. It's getting a bit better, but we'll keep an eye on that one. So next up, we've got an extract from that conversation with Derren Martin, who's the Director of Valuations there at CAP HPI. And as I said earlier, he'll be talking all about the used value trends in March and over the first quarter of this year as we head towards the end of March. So stay tuned for that one now.
And Derren, as you say, you've closed the book on March, and the March figure is up 0.5% at that 3-year 60,000 mark, which equates to around £30. How does this actually compare with previous Marches? And also, as a follow-up to that, how much are used values impacted over the course of March by the plate change?
So compared to previous Marches, it's strong. It's the joint biggest movement up that we've seen in March since we introduced CAP Live in 2012. So 0.5%. We saw that in 2014, a long time ago. Since then, we've not really seen value moves going up by that amount. And obviously, if you took ICE in isolation, that would be a 0.8% increase. So It has been strong compared to previous months of March. I mean, last year, although it was a strong year, values actually dropped by 2.1% in March. We did have a couple of weak months around this time last year. So it's been strong, impacted by the plate change. I think what you've seen this year, maybe more than in pre-COVID times, certainly, is franchise dealers that would tend to be a little bit switched off from used car activity to focus on new. They have continued to be very active in the used car market. So the impact of the plate change hasn't really been felt too much in March. It tends to be, obviously, you get a lot of volume in the new car market in March historically, and that tends to sort of be towards the end of March or into April before that starts to hit the market in volume enough to affect values. So it doesn't have a massive impact. But yet, to answer your first question, compared to previous months of March, it has been a strong period, but it's only been a small movement up. It's not dramatic. We're not having another 2021 where values increased in a sort of a crazy fashion. They've just been edging up over the last few months.
And that's an interesting point you make about franchise dealers not switching off this month and concentrating on used as well as new.
Yeah, well, that's where their bread and butter is. That's where they can make profits. We have seen some margin squeeze with trade prices being a bit high, and retail prices being high as well. So with trade going up, been very difficult to push retail up. So there's been a little bit of a squeeze on margins there. But overall, it's the bread and butter of the industry, the used cars. So it's demand has been very healthy throughout the first quarter from the consumers. So dealers have been out there looking to buy cars. And
before we talk about battery electric vehicles compared to petrol and diesel and put some context behind what's been happening in that sector, but what are the stood out in terms of rises and falls in March and sort of age bandings and sector types? Because as you pointed out earlier, that 10-year 100k has dropped 1.3%, whereas sort of your 3 and your 5 year have gone up, and your 0 to 1 has remained fairly stable.
Yeah, so when you look at by age, yeah, that 0.5 is at 3 years. 5 years has gone up by 0.4. So, I mean, they're small amounts in monetary terms. I think we said sort of between about £30, something like that. But that is very much an average, obviously. We look at everything in isolation and move things accordingly. The weakness at the older age, those cars have been strong for this year. Maybe they can't continue to go up. There's a reluctance for dealers to buy work that may sit in the workshop, especially with margins being squeezed. They want to get cars moved off their forecourts fairly quickly, so they're looking at nice cap clean cars rather than average or below. So some of that older stuff maybe not for them, but as I say, it's been strong for a long time, and that 1.3% is not. I mean, it's low in monetary terms. It's around £50. So. And we have to remember that values do tend to go down in normal times. We do see values going down as cars age in their life cycle. So by looking at sectors, all of the mainstream sectors at that 3 year point have all increased, not by much, as I say. I mean, probably the ones that have increased the most have been the city car, but that's only by 0.6%. MPV has only gone up by 0.1%. Super minis went up by 0.7%. And upper medium went up by 0.8. So it's kind of those three, super minis, upper medium, and city cars, that have gone up by the most of mainstream sectors. But the devil very much in the detail on those cars as well. And on city cars, we've seen things like Fiat 500 and Peugeot 108 that have actually dropped in value slightly, again, by about 1%. Whereas cars such as the Fiat Panda, the Hyundai i10, Skoda Citigo have actually increased by between 3 and 4%. Which is about £250. So a strong performance for some of those city cars, and there's not so many of those in the new market now, because the OEMs are focusing more on SUVs and electric, and there aren't many electric city cars. So so that sector's kind of done well. SUVs increased by 0.5%, but large SUVs actually dropped by 0.7%. So the strength has been in those sort of medium and small models. And again, the devil's in the detail there, because we've seen things like the BMW X5, the petrol version's actually dropped by a couple of percent, whereas the diesel's increased by 1%. So as you can see, we look at it in a lot of detail, and there's lots of different things going on there. But overall, most of the mainstream sector's strong, and the most of the petrol, diesel have been strong as well. So it's EVs and a little bit of that older stuff. Convertibles have been strong as well. They've gone up, which tends to happen at this time of year.
I'm going to say that the coupe cab convertible market right across all age points looks like they've all gone up. So maybe we're just at that point now where people start to think about that coupe cab convertible market. And we've seen that over the last 3 years go all over the place, haven't we? In some significant strength, as many in the early days of the lockdowns. I remember you saying the strength that people were going out buying those coupe cab convertibles, that second car with the money they had. Yeah,
buying a toy. It's the old accidental savers at the time, which seems like a long time ago now that we were talking about things like that. But yeah, those tend to get strong at this time of year when the weather improves.
And Derren, turning to EVs, you made an interesting point at the beginning that overall values would have risen 0.8% if you strip out EVs. So if we look at EVs, values across the board with EVs were down 5.4%, equating to £1,500. But you're reporting an actual slowing down in the rate of fall that we've been talking about for the last several months now. Why do you think this is?
It's quite dangerous to talk about EVs in general now. We've been doing that for sort of the last, the industry has been doing it for the last sort of few months, especially since Tesla made their new pricing moves in January. And it has affected the whole market, the drops, not necessarily because of Tesla dropping prices. It's because of a drop in demand and an increase in supply. So, but the devil really is in the detail on EVs. And we've seen that some have stabilized after some very hefty drops. I mean, that 5.4% compares to previous months where we had values decreased by 7.5% and 6.6% in the previous 2 months. So The average cumulative movement for EVs over the last 7 months is about 30%. So almost a third of values on average being knocked off prices. And what that's meant is that some have now stabilized. I mean, the things like the Model 3, you can now see those advertised between 20 and 30,000 pounds. And some of those are down near to 20,000 pounds. So you think about a Model 3, an aspirational vehicle. Tesla remains aspirational. That has led to dealers sort of coming back into the market on Tesla Model 3 and going probably not in massive volume whilst they test the market, but certainly Model 3, Jaguar I-Pace, that's another one that's dropped a lot in value recently and has now stabilized, and also the Audi e-tron. They saw some reductions early in the month, but they've actually ended up the month with some small increases. So they've done okay, but there are other models that continue to drop in quite large chunks. And we've seen the Golf Electric has dropped 10.5% this month, which is about £1,400. I mean, that's a lot of money in a month, but that's off the back of previous drops as well. Kia Soul Electric, Seat Mii Electric, they've all dropped by over 10%. Peugeot 2008, Tesla Model X. So whilst the Model 3 stabilised, the Model X has come down nearly £5,000 at 3 years old. So the Zoe, Volkswagen ID3, they've all continued to drop. So some have stabilised, some have dropped. And when you look at that lower end for some of those cars, things like the Leaf, that's dropped in value as well. The Leaf, the Zoe, if you're a consumer going in to buy a car, an EV, and you realise that on a monthly payment you might be able to get a Model 3 for not a lot more, that's hugely aspirational and a bit of a game changer. And I think of some concern maybe where that bottom end needs to sit now, compared to some of those cars that have dropped by 30% in price. So if they're now looking at sort of £20,000, £25,000 retail for some Tesla product, where does that Leaf and Zoe need to sit in comparison?
Well, some great insight there from Derren, as usual, and some interesting stats there. I was intrigued by how the price rise. Once you strip out all the EV vehicles, prices would have actually gone up 0.8%. But most of the falls, or certainly some of the harder falls, were experienced in that EV basket.
Yeah, and it shows how strong that when you look at it and you as you say, strip out that battery electric, and we've seen it over the last few months with that as well, that how strong the combustion engine market is because of the shortage of supply and everything that's going on there. And interesting there with Derren, that actually the variance now between battery electric vehicles, that some are starting to slow and some have actually increased in price as well. So a lot of volatility around that battery electric vehicle marketplace, as we said there. So again, listen to the full interview on your podcast feed if you've not done so already.
You're listening to all the chatter that matters on Motor Trade Radio, powered by eBay Motors Group. This is your weekly one-stop shop for all the biggest car retailing headlines from across the media, available on demand wherever you are on your podcast feed.
For this half of our used car special, we're delighted to welcome to the podcast Phill Jones, Chief Operating Officer of eBay Motors Group. Welcome back, Phill. Good to have you back on the show. How's the world of online classifieds looking this month?
Yeah, hi chaps. It's great to be back. Yeah, busy, both from a sort of traffic to the website and just from a business perspective. Busy fools, I don't know, but definitely lots of opportunity out there.
And then everyone like us wanting to know what you're seeing and what trends you're seeing and things like this, as everybody tries to understand what's happening in the market at the minute as well. I guess. Yeah,
definitely, and there's kind of a lot going on, right? We see sort of stock challenges, continues, particularly franchise and supermarkets. I think that'll be the theme for much of this year. Demand is high, so we had record traffic to motor.co.uk. A little softness in conversion to lead. And dealers are still trading cars quickly, but I think we're on a sort of a tightrope of supply and demand. So it's
Interesting times.
Sort of, it's on the line, really.
Yeah, firstly, welcome back to the podcast. As Curtis said, it's great to have you back on. So, ideally, what we want to try and think about is what you've been seeing through some of the standout used car retailing trends that you've been tracking in the market view over the first quarter. Because obviously, we do read the key stats from the market view on a regular basis on the podcast, and we always cite the listeners to take a deeper dive into the monthly market view. But in your eyes, what are the key trends and standout used car retailing that you've been seeing through this first quarter of 2023?
Yeah, I guess as I say, I think stock challenges is the thing that hurts people the most. On the face of it, people are selling cars quickly; they just can't sell them fast enough. So I think that kind of continues, and like demand looks really strong in terms of traffic, but there is softness to conversion to lead. So I just think there's a little bit of trepidation going in. I think consumers are still unsure as to how things kind of play out. So it's not quite volatile, but it just for me, there's just an air of trepidation as people sort of try to find the new normal.
Do you think that's mainly down to sort of the economy? Do you think it's kind of that? Do you think it's this uncertainty around the cost of living, the energy issues?
Yeah, absolutely.
Etc.
You look at used car transactions. They're still kind of below levels that we've seen kind of pre-COVID. It's partly kind of due to supply, but there is sort of an underlying level of transactions that need to occur just because people's cars get older and the finance agreements kind of run out. But yeah, there's no doubt. I don't think there's many people out there feeling flush with cash and thinking, how can I go and spend some money this weekend? The used car market is relatively counter-cyclical, but yeah, I think that we will just kind of see this throughout, where consumers are just kind of nervous, and in particular, they probably just need to kind of maybe work those leads a little bit harder. As I say, I don't think anyone's feeling particularly flush at the moment.
Now, Phill, research for March's market view analysis has just been completed. What trends stood out for you in terms of pricing, stock, and overall demand?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually. We've spent a bit of time trying to unpick it ourselves, because supply and demand kind of do this merry dance, and kind of the output is pricing, right? So typically high demand and low supply puts pressure on prices to increase, but in general we see stability. So this is kind of intrigued the math students amongst us. Like, as an average across our site, we've seen a slight decrease month on month in prices, 1.6%. And then you look at other releases and people are talking about slight increases. And so our average is quite misleading. It's kind of worth talking through. Like, the way that we calculate our averages, it's an average of the value of all of the cars across our website. And so when you look down into certain kind of brackets, so like 2 to 5 year old vehicles are up 0.7%, 5 to 10 year old vehicles are up 0.5%. But we then see declines in cars under 2 years and over 10 years, kind of only the sort of slightly the other way. But the thing that brings down the average in general is actually the impact of stock shortages in the younger cars. So on our site, we have slightly more of the older cars, and the older cars have kind of seen kind of less of an increase and sometimes a decrease, as that pulls down the overall average. Now, I don't know if there's anything particularly interesting in that, or whether it's just a reflection of kind of core stability. That, as I say, we're kind of on that line where some things might be slightly up and some things might be slightly down. But I think it's really interesting. There's a lot going on to kind of give you a kind of effectively, an under 2% change in prices, really.
And we are still working through that shortfall of new cars that haven't been sold over the last 3 years, aren't we? So that will start to feed into the used car pricing that you're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we don't expect there to be loads of supply coming out into the market. So again, I don't expect prices to kind of, drop really. But then likewise, we don't see consumer kind of volumes kind of like massively increasing. Demand is high, as I say, but people are sort of a little bit more hesitant to convert to leads. So, I mean, it kind of like, we should be kind of grateful, really. Today we're talking about stability after kind of a couple of years of sort of talking about volatility. So there's quite a lot going on in terms of to get us to those kind of very sort of small percentages. So, dealers, as ever, just need to kind of remain astute to kind of, what's happening right now.
And as you say, in terms of demand, consumer demand is still possibly more robust than maybe we thought it was going to be with the impacts of the cost of living crisis.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, record traffic across our site, strong volumes of leads. As I say, there's a slight, and it is very much a slight kind of reduction in the conversion to lead. And some of our consumer insight shows us that people are a little nervous and sometimes delaying the car purchase. But as I say, in the used car market, people often need to buy a car. So there's always a good underlying level of transactions, and we're still far below where we have been in the past. So there's room to grow. I still think we're at kind of the base level of transactions. But yeah, there's still kind of lots to unpick within that. So,
and I mean, this week we've had Derren Martin's monthly update on the trade market, and he gave his view on obviously the first quarter and some of the trends from a trade perspective, but obviously EV has remained the key topic of discussion for throughout this sort of first quarter of this year. I mean, from your perspective, EV stocking levels and pricing are obviously hot topics at the minute. I mean, did any trends stand out this month as we start to see this significant drop in some values, but not all values? We're seeing supply coming back in. Some of the vehicles are now entering reasonably positive pricing points from a consumer perspective of used consumers getting into that EV market. Was there any sort of standout points in the data that you've seen this month?
Yeah, I guess I sort of check myself really in terms of saying that overall we kind of see relative stability. EV market is the one place where there is much more volatility, where you see double-digit movements in stuff. But I guess I just have to add the sort of the sense check that for us, EV is still kind of a fairly small percentage of our activity. North of 90% of the eyeballs on our website are still going to petrol and diesel. So, those are the things that are kind of the bastions of kind of our averages, and, the bastion of kind of consumer interest and activity. But people are considering EVs and they're looking closely at it. And yeah, it's really interesting to make sure that dealers don't overcorrect really too much, because there's a lot of kind of demand still out there. But yeah, we saw some big old price reductions in EV. And I guess what's quite interesting is we saw the biggest decreases in older EVs. So we all kind of know about the impacts of kind of Tesla on kind of new and kind of the nearly new market. But the EVs that had the biggest price drops for us were actually the older ones, which I guess is kind of, logical, right? In that those sort of 2-3-year-old cars are probably much more affordable. And given the way that technology and kind of battery range has changed, it probably is having a knock-on impact on kind of those older ones. So like a 3-year-old 40,000-mile Golf E is down 11% month on month. So it's really, similar thing in terms of Nissan Leaf and the such like. So you can see it having the sort of bow wave effect. But, you then got volatility the other side. A 6-month-old Taycan is up 9%, which is a shame. I think I need them to fall about 70 or 80% before I can get one.
Get to your price point there, yeah. Don't we all?
Yes. Now, Phill, staying with EVs, last week you also published some new consumer insight panel research on how falling prices are actually impacting used EV adoption. What were the key takeaways from the research?
Yeah, so really interesting in that 43% of consumers, a very specific number, are aware of falling EV values. So I guess that shows you the PR impact of Tesla. And we're kind of seeing this in other places as well. So it took consumers a while to understand that cars were increasing in price kind of post-COVID, but they very quickly picked up on EVs. And uncertainty and volatility aren't the friends of consumer confidence. So 40% of customers are willing to wait up to 12 months if prices keep going down. And obviously that doesn't help a retailer, because that just leads to, you know, delays in purchase. And what was then quite interesting is that there's almost an equal split between consumers considering new EVs or used EVs. And I think that reflects more a sort of a change in the purchase model, because people are predominantly looking at EVs on a monthly payment basis. And that gives you much more kind of ability to compare new versus used. And then you're kind of looking at kind of technology upgrades and range upgrades and the such like. So yeah, I think it shows that there is demand for EVs. We know that there's a lot of people considering it and, you know, interested in it being the next car. And they're probably going to the next stage now of getting that research and really understanding the market and trying to find their time to move. But yeah, volatility just doesn't help anyone in terms of pushing consumers over the line.
And that's an interesting point you make about that equal consideration for new or used. And it does kind of make you wonder where the journey begins. Is the buyer looking for used first and then switching to new, or vice versa?
Yeah, in particular, I mean, I think, you know, we're a used car site, but, you know, it drives me mad because I think most people are considering they want a new car, you know, they want a different car. And I think there's probably a lot more explanation that needs to be done from a consumer perspective around how they help consider used versus new. You know, the internet kind of throws people one way or the other way. You know, it's not just us, you know, OEM websites do the same thing. So I think it's really interesting. I think that's a really kind of clear statement that consumer car buying habits are changing slightly, because yeah, the game is different.
Yeah.
And I mean, throughout all of this, I mean, you talk to many sort of franchise independent and car supermarkets, and I mean, what are they telling you about their challenges and opportunities focused on that used market at the minute? We know the volume of production that we've lost over the last 3 years. We know the impact that that's having in terms of that vehicles entering that used vehicle park. You know, we talked to Derren about that shortage of petrol and diesel products, and then we've got the oversupply in some areas of battery electric vehicles. But the whole landscape, for whether you're a franchise dealer with what's going on in their world, independents trying to survive, and then obviously the growth around the car supermarkets, what are the challenges and opportunities that they're telling you at the minute, Phill?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because, you know, there's no doubt stock shortages are hurting franchise and supermarket more than the independent sector. The independent sector seems relatively kind of stable on that. So you kind of have this sort of a Greek tragedy, really, where they're selling cars quickly and they're still making good money on them on a kind of an individual unit basis, but they're really struggling to get the volumes in that they need to. And I guess for some of these businesses, they've got big operational overheads, and they are predicated on trading a certain volume of cars. And I just don't see some of those cars coming back. So I think that, you know, I think there's a lot of businesses asking themselves questions around where they think it will be in 2 to 3 years' time and how they optimize their business for that. I mean, looking at our data for March, you normally see a fairly strong uptick in stock volume for franchise dealers in March as the part exchanges start coming in from the new plate. We haven't quite seen that. That might just be a sort of a delayed impact. We'll kind of see that in April. But yeah, I kind of feel for these dealers, because the operational model sort of seems to imply that they can just scale up, but you can't scale up if the cars aren't there. So I then think that when you consider that consumer demand is high, but there's still that sort of trepidation in, as I say, in terms of the conversion rate, dealers definitely can't afford for used car volumes to go backwards. So I think you're going to see them having to lean in a bit to consumer conversations and marketing and the such like to make sure they nurture those, because you can't recover kind of those in any poor months. You've got to be on top of your game, because it's so hard to just kind of transact at the current levels of used cars that are required.
And finally, Phill, as we head into the Easter holiday period, do you anticipate increased online search activity over the next couple of weeks? And is there an Easter equivalent to the Boxing Day bounce that you guys tend to notice over the Christmas period?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as I say, demand is high. I think that bank holidays in general are good times for people to be out there. So we tend to see traffic kind of relatively high just going into the bank holiday weekend, and I think people sometimes use that as a chance to get out. May might be a bit different in terms of everyone's in party mood for the coronation, but I think that my advice to dealers is just being aware of where the consumers come from, and if they are nervous, think about which messages you need to dial up. So do you need to dial up monthly payment? Do you dial up the value and the benefit of warranty or kind of after sales care? I think consumers are there, and they probably still have the core need to change their car, but they might just need a little bit more encouragement and reassurance to actually make it into the showroom.
And that messaging is really important, isn't it? Because that's something that can be done relatively quickly, can't it? Depending on the sort of ebbs and flows of demand.
Yeah, and absolutely, and get it across everything. So don't just have some leaflets in the showroom. Remember that the car kind of buying process starts online. It starts on people come to classifieds, then it goes to the website. So you've got to be really consistent in your messaging, and you've got to dial that message down to something that could be seen on a smartphone and is really clear and really quick and easy for consumers to understand. So yeah, I think there's a bit more need to give people a reason to buy.
And do you think that's accelerated more in since not necessarily the lockdown, the pandemic, this shift toward the digital space? I think that the retailers need to be on top of their game in terms of that digital space, and as you say, that messaging a lot more than they've ever had been before.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone should have always been doing it. You'll probably kind of look back and hear me saying the same thing kind of years ago. I think that I think COVID really forced people, and the rise of Kazoo and Cinch really forced people to up their games. And I'd say this just now becomes a consumer expectation, and there are a lot of dealer groups who are doing this well and getting kind of slick kind of little sound bites and kind of really kind of making their brand look slick, taking really good photos, making it really enticing. So you've got to make sure you operate at that higher standard, because that's the new norm. Think about it from a consumer's perspective. What do you want and expect on anything else, and how quickly and easily it is for us to just scroll and skip by something on our phones. We're really fighting for attention in this day and age.
Yeah, and like you say, probably more so than ever now, isn't it? I mean, because stock is prime at the minute, in terms of availability is challenging to your point, independent dealers compared to your supermarket growth, and then your franchise in their area, some of them move into that agency model, which we haven't sort of talked about, but it becomes quite competitive in that space. We haven't got a significant oversupply of used vehicle products. So one, you need to make sure you're on the ball in terms of attracting that customer, but also that pricing point as well into at the minute and maximising your opportunity.
Yeah, 100% as ever. It's you can never take your eye off the ball in this game, right? And dealers have to work that data really, really hard. I mean, my advice is always to look at the data, but also speak to consumers, understand how they found their way into your showroom, understand their kind of their nervousness, their habits. Look at lost leads. You've really got to kind of like squeeze that stone harder than ever, really.
And is that the same in terms of understanding your customers, understanding who you are to your customer, who your customers are, who your customer base is?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. And I think we probably all overstate our own importance, and what people think about us, and do they understand you, whether you're a family business, they understand you're part of a big group, do they understand the kind of the real USPs, because they're all scrolling on their phone and distracted by life and and the rest of the internet. So you've really got to kind of like challenge yourself to distill those messages and down. We just live in an age where attention is kind of the most precious commodity, I think.
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, as always, I mean, it's a pleasure having you back on, and we do need to get you back on a more regular basis, Phill, because it's always getting your view on what you're seeing, what you're hearing within that consumer marketplace. And
brilliant, it's always good fun.
Yeah, and for anybody listening, if you haven't, as always, checked out the market reviews, they are always available on the eBay Motors Group.co.uk website. So there's a lot more detail on there, as we always say when we talk about the market review, in terms of the activity by make, model, fuel type, etc., price points, everything else is on there. So please do check out the market review if you haven't done so already. But just again, thank you for myself for coming on again today, Phill, and thanks for sharing some of your thoughts on what's happening on the consumer market.
Brilliant. Thanks, gents.
Thanks very much, Phill.
No worries.
Well, great interview there with Phill Jones from eBay Motors Group, and very revealing about how consumer demand is looking at the moment, really across the board, and some interesting insight as ever on EVs.
No, and let's say we obviously had the snippet of Derren Martin right at the start of today's podcast, and the whole interview is available on your podcast feed from earlier on the week. But it was great how that sort of top and tailed with what Derren was saying within the trade market and the wholesale environment around that activity towards used cars, but actually from Phil's perspective in that consumer world. And what I found quite fascinating with Phill, when we started talking at the end there about that being on top of your game in terms of that digital space, understanding changing your habits to suit the customer's requirements. I mean, we talk about EVs. And how do you get your EV buyer into used battery electric vehicles? Because they haven't got any tax benefits.
Yeah.
So you have to think about it differently. And people talk about different environments, different platforms, different sites for battery electric buyers, because they are looking differently. They need different things, don't they?
Yeah, and he made a really good point there about dealers are fighting for attention, aren't they? And I think we often forget that the first point of contact of any search is probably, as Phill said, on a mobile phone. It's not on a desktop, it's not on a laptop, it's on a mobile. And to get that messaging out there, it's pretty tough, isn't it? It is a challenge. It's a sort of ongoing challenge for dealers.
And at the minute, it's more so, isn't it? Because the shortage of stock, but actually, that need for that customer, is more prevalent than ever before, and it is now in that digital space. About your functionality, the way you present your cars, the information that you give, and the other areas that you give the consumer. You may only get one chance at attracting that consumer's attention before they move on, and then you've lost it, then, haven't you, for good? So it is an interesting space, that one. But I mean, again, this week we cited some of the key headlines, but we wanted to focus on the sort of trade and retail aspects of the first quarter of this year as we come to the end of the first plate month of the year and what's been happening. It's a crucial quarter of any year is Q1. So hopefully you've managed to get some interesting insight there. And as I said, if you want to hear the full interview there with Derren Martin from Cap HPI on not just March but Q1, then do check out your podcast feed from early on the week. But again, great interviews there with both Derren and Phill there, Curtis.
Yeah, definitely. But that is all for now. So many thanks for joining us on the Motor Trade Radio podcast. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
You've been listening to Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group. We'll be sharing all the links from this week's headlines on Monday morning. So to make sure you receive them, just subscribe to the free newsletter on our LinkedIn page. Just search Motor Trade Radio Podcast.